This is my presentation on the Soviet Union command economy, and I'll start it by going into the economic experiments that occurred after the Bolshevik Revolution. They were highly influential in the policies and decisions that Stalin would later make in the 1920s. Their first policy was war communism, and pretty much what this entailed was it was implemented by Lenin, and this included the beginning of state control and ownership, which was facilitated through nationalization, an attempt to destroy market relationships in industry and trade, as well as involuntary requisitioning of agricultural products from the peasants. This didn't work as it caused the economy to go to shambles. The second policy was the new economic policy. This implemented partially reverting back to old ways in the sense that they're having greater private ownership, despite the fact that the commanding heights of industry were still nationalized. Furthermore, this plan would reintroduce the market as a method of resource allocation. And it kind of worked because by the 1929, they had recovered from the losses of the Russian Civil War. So, what can be really learned about the period that happened between 1917 and 1928? So, there are many things that can be learned. For example, if the market is to be eliminated, there must be some sort of mechanism for coordinating the market and taking its place. And this is due to the fact that in war communism, Lenin nationalized industries and eliminated the market, but they had no plan of any sort of institution to take the place. Secondly, there was kind of a sentiment that the peasants were gaining a scary amount of influence, considering that, like in the pace of industrialization, because the agricultural sector made up a large portion of the economy. So, Stalin, the leader who succeeded Lenin, made three decisions that were very fundamental in the creation of the Soviet Union. And the first being that he established a system of central planning that would listen to the state and party directives. Therefore, there became no more market relationships in the industry, and there was a notable shift in using industrial production for producer goods as opposed to consumer goods. Secondly, the agricultural was collectivized, meaning that the farm would work collectively, and the collectivized farm networks accounted for 90% of Soviet peasant households by the mid 1930s. Third, the system of government in place was a totalitarian government. So, the decision making of the Soviet Union. So, it operated through the Communist Party, and pretty much the Soviet Union was a centralized nation whose state and party organizations were the main decision makers in terms of production, distribution, and accumulation. Despite this, market forces and external factors had some sort of influence, for example, in the allocation of labor as well as the underground economy. And starting in 1929, the Soviet Union had a working arrangement, and this included the Soviet Union to be nominally governed by an elected government, but the operative organ was the Council of Ministers at the federal and Republican level, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or the CPSU, was the group that focused on the decision-making, control, and supervision. Lower levels, such as regional and local organizations, they kind of just controlled and monitored the allocation of resources at these levels, and the operational decisions were made through the Gosplan, which was the state planning committee. The Gosplan turned directives into operative plans, but it was the responsibility of the individual firms to actually carry out these plans. So, general directives were given by the CPSU, and the Gosplan would convert these directives into control figures. Then the control figures would be transmitted through the ministries down to the individual enterprises. Then the control figures would be moved back up to the hierarchy, and the Gosplan at the level were balanced. Once the balance was achieved, the plan would just be disaggregated, and pretty much it would just go through the hierarchy again. And the final result was Tech Prom Fin plans, or technical industrial financial plans. So, the principal agent problem. So, plans were a theoretical exercise, and in reality, the resource allocations were done by state and party officials and often did not meet demand. So, Soviet managers were rewarded based on how they kind of fulfilled the plan with perks such as bonus money, housing, vacations, automobiles, and promotions. And the gross value of input was pretty much the most important target. So this is what managers focused on, to the sacrifice of efficiency, cost, and mix of assortment of products in the plan. So the managers who were close to the operations understood that resources required, and they understood the true capacity, but the targets were set by superiors who just kind of like put an optimal target, so there was kind of a disconnect in the communication. Furthermore, the principal-agent conflict, it caused a lot of unintended behaviors, which included like trying to secure easy, achievable targets by enterprises, like this is how they're behaving. In addition, hoarding materials in the short supply, avoiding innovation, and ignoring profitability. So the monitoring of the agents. So the Soviet Union, so the monitoring of the agents was not really done effectively, and any close investigation would usually find violations, since managers often needed to break the plan law in order to fulfill targets. So there was a shortage of managers, especially those who knew how to maximize output. So the Gosbank, which is the state bank, was also used to monitor economic activity, since all the transactions were recorded with the Gosbank. And ruble control is based on the principle that every transaction results in inflow and matching outflow of funds. So in reality, this was not as straightforward, as transactions sometimes reduced to multiple smaller transactions. Unofficial transactions would occur between enterprises, or cash would just be used. So there's a lot of problems. In the Soviet economy, prices were set by party planners and not consumer demand. And so therefore prices were adjusted very infrequently, and between 1955 and 1982, there was actually only 2 major price reforms. And furthermore, the supply of consumer goods was also set by planners. And planners used a turnover tax to try to balance the supply and demand. And the turnover tax is the difference between retail price set by the planners and wholesale price given to the producers. And the turnover tax included in the price paid rather than added on. So the consumers were not really aware of it, and it was kind of transparent to the consumers, or not transparent to the consumers. So furthermore, the prices of land were really difficult to determine, since land was allocated to farms by the party and rent was not really charged, as well as the price of labor or wages that were set for each industrial branch. A branch had a base wage rate and wage differentials within this branch, and they were determined by like skill grades, and administrative authorities could adjust wages by changing the base or changing the schedule. So the demand by labor was determined by the labor requirements and the output for targets. So during the Soviet Union era, demand for consumer goods rose, and as wages increased, however, the state wanted to produce more producer goods and not really consumer goods. So they let the prices rise to influence supply. However, prices were not allowed to rise fully to observe the increase in demand, because which is called repressed inflation. So savings were regarded as evidence of repressed inflation, since consumers had nothing to buy to satisfy their demand. So capital allocation. So capital investments were determined by authorities and the ministries. And pretty much the planners needed a tool to decide on whether to invest in projects that are capital intensive with low operating costs, or less capital intensive projects with high operating costs. So the coefficient of relative effectiveness was used to compare the projects, and the projects that have been the lowest full cost should be selected. So the capital investment was multiplied by the nominative coefficient, and in addition, it was added to the current operating cost to come up with a project cost. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Furthermore, agriculture accounted for 25% of the Soviet GDP, and there was kind of 4 major changes that happened to agriculture. And the first one, major change that happened after the 1940s, when the mergers placed less value on collective farms, so they reduced the number of them. And in turn, they were creating more state farms, and on average, the state farms would actually be larger. The second change that happened was the machine tractor stations were abolished in 1958, and their equipment was sold to the farms. And this move really just gave the farm managers greater control over their farm equipment. Thirdly, rural incomes rose rapidly after the 1950s. So this meant that more rapid like they were increasing more rapid than industrial incomes, and a pension system was also added in the 1960s to increase welfare of rural workers. The fourth one was a series of campaigns run by Nikita Khrushchev that placed a greater emphasis on improved productivity through increases in agricultural investment. So international trade. So there are three major institutions that really dealt with the trade decision making, and this being the Ministry of Foreign Trade, or the MFT, the Bank of Foreign Trade, or the BFT, or the Foreign Trade Organizations, or the FTOs. And so for both imports and exports, enterprises would deal with the FTOs in a domestic currency, and the FTOs would, via financial arrangements handled by the MTF and BTF, they would actually do the trading. So the Soviet Union largely used bilateral trading, which was really similar to bartering. And that's the end of my presentation on the Soviet Union command economy.